The first thing anyone told you about Celestia Station was that it was the most diplomatically significant location in the known galaxy. The second thing was that it was also the easiest place to accidentally start a war by pointing with the wrong number of fingers. Daniel Reeves had received both pieces of information during his 3-week crash course on Concordance Protocol, sandwiched between a 40-page briefing on Valorian bioluminescent etiquette and a harrowing audio recording of what happened when a human trade delegate had absent-mindedly crossed his arms during a Krelnak territorial declaration. The recording lasted 11 minutes. The resulting mediation had lasted 9 months. Daniel had listened to the whole thing twice. Then, once more just to be certain he understood what kind of world he was walking into. That had been 4 months ago. Now he stood at the entrance to the Grand Convergence Hall and tried to recall every single thing he had memorized, while simultaneously accepting that none of it had truly prepared him for this. The hall was alive in ways that exceeded metaphor. Celestia Station's environmental AI managed gravity fields in real time across every section of the floor, shifting orientation and pull strength to accommodate species whose homeworlds ranged from 0.3G desert moons to 4.2G ocean giants. What resulted was a space where beings walked on surfaces angled at 45 degrees to each other, where the ceiling in one section functioned as a perfectly usable floor in another. The space rose so high that its upper atmosphere generated genuine weather, soft luminous clouds drifting 40 stories above the assembly floor, lit from beneath by the bioluminescent signatures of thousands of beings whose biology produced light as naturally as breathing. The hall was so large it had its own ecosystem. He had not fully expected that. The briefing documents had mentioned it, but there was a significant gap between reading the hall contains its own weather patterns and standing at the entrance watching a slow aurora of cloud formations drift through a space built entirely for diplomatic proceedings. Daniel had a datapad. He was taking notes. It felt like the appropriate response to the incomprehensible. "You have your mouth open," said a voice at his shoulder. "I am professionally processing," he said without turning. "Your mouth is open." He closed it. Lena Park had been with Earth's diplomatic corps for 2 years longer than Daniel, and possessed the particular gift of appearing completely competent in any situation, including situations that warranted genuine existential reflection. She handed him a travel mug of something approximating coffee, and stood beside him as thousands of beings from hundreds of species moved through the enormous space below. "There is a delegation in the North Wing that is technically not matter," Daniel said, in any conventional sense of that word. "Their physical substrate is organized photon interference. They exist as a pattern rather than a substance, and they vote in concordance proceedings." Lena said, "So try not to walk through them." "How would I know if I did?" "You would feel it." "Apparently it is extremely unpleasant for everyone involved and requires a formal apology that takes 3 weeks to compose correctly." He filed that away with the other 57 things he had filed away in the past 20 minutes, and followed her down into the assembly floor. The human section of the Grand Convergence Hall was modest. That was the diplomatic phrasing. The accurate phrasing was that Earth's delegation occupied a corner of the assembly roughly equivalent to being seated in the very last row of a very large theater, beside the emergency exit, next to 3 other civilizations that had also recently achieved faster-than-light travel, and were also still working out where to put their hands. The Braxton delegation occupied the space to their left, insectoid and six-limbed, their chitin plating cycling through colors Daniel's database identified as mild to moderate anxiety. The Vethiri took the space to their right, quadrupedal and communicating primarily through vibration, their presence generating a low resonant hum Daniel felt in his back teeth more than heard. Beyond them sat the Kerali, beings of living crystal whose communication required 17 full seconds of processing lag before it resolved into meaning, which made conversations with them feel like standing at the edge of something vast and waiting for an echo to return. 30 years of Concordance membership, and this was humanity's neighborhood. The new arrivals section, the table by the kitchen, in galactic terms. Ambassador Chen Yiling held their section's forward position, with the practiced stillness of someone who had spent 3 decades performing composure in rooms where composure was the only viable currency. 62 years old, 4 galactic postings. A career that included negotiating trade frameworks with species whose concept of a binding contract intersected with their concept of time in ways that made conventional legal clauses philosophically difficult. She had represented humanity in rooms where humanity's 30 years of concordance membership constituted a rounding error in the historical record. She did it with stillness, precision, and a dignity Daniel privately found extraordinary by the concordance's measure. She was a junior representative of a probationary species. Her delegation's formal acknowledgement at these proceedings would occur somewhere around the 45th minute of the opening ceremony, bundled with 7 other civilizations in a collective recognition that translated, in the unofficial parlance of galactic diplomacy, to and also, these people exist. Daniel took his position behind her and opened his monitoring interface. His official role was cultural liaison assistant. What it meant in practice was that he spent every summit session watching, tracking microsignals across dozens of physiological systems simultaneously, bioluminescent patterns, acoustic frequencies, postural geometry, the subtle choreography of beings trying to communicate across evolutionary distances measured in geological time. He was genuinely good at it. He had known that for years. In the quiet way, you knew something that no one else was measuring, with complete internal certainty and no external reference point to confirm or deny it. The session began. Concordance summits operated on a scale that made human political proceedings look like a meeting about parking. The opening session covered 17 agenda items, including trade route adjustments affecting 43 species, resource disputes across 3-star systems, a formal complaint from a civilization that existed partially in the near future and kept accidentally providing spoilers for ongoing negotiations, and a lengthy debate about whether a specific type of matter reorganization constituted resource extraction or artistic expression. Daniel tracked it all, not because he was required to. His assigned scope was the human section and its immediate neighbors, flagging cultural signals relevant to Earth's delegation specifically. But he had developed the habit over 6 years of monitoring wider, noting how the ancient civilizations argued, how centuries of precedent shaped what looked from the outside like improvised debate, how power moved through rooms like this in currents that were invisible until you understood what you were watching for. During the second hour, he noticed the Krelnak's secondary representative beginning a postural shift, his database flagged as suppressed territorial stress. The official translators were not flagging it. The session chair was not flagging it. It was the kind of thing that read as nothing until it became something. And by the time it became something, there would be a formal protest and 2 hours of remediation. Daniel composed a brief note through the back-channel interface. 3 sentences. Sent it to the session's administrative coordinator, framed not as an alert but as a scheduling suggestion. 3 minutes later, the coordinator called a brief procedural recess. The Krelnak representative used it. The session resumed without incident. Daniel's monitoring log recorded the flag. The official proceedings record did not. He moved on to the next signal. Later, he noticed a Tharsis Trade Consortium representative, showing signs of escalating discomfort. Their entire social structure was organized around acknowledgement protocol, and the current speaker had addressed 3 other delegations by name without acknowledging the Tharsis group, who clearly considered themselves within the relevant grouping. Left uncorrected, it would build into a formal objection that would burn 30 minutes of summit time. 3 words to the procedural assistant. 1 brief parenthetical acknowledgement in the speaker's next breath. The Tharsis representative's posture relaxed. The session continued. No incident. No record. Nothing. An hour into the session, he caught something that illustrated the problem more precisely. A junior translator for one of the mid-tier delegations made an error in real time, rendering a nuanced term of diplomatic qualification as a flat declarative, subtly but meaningfully changing the standing of a proposal under consideration. The official translation review team did not catch it. The senior representatives, whose databases should have flagged the discrepancies, did not catch it. Daniel caught it because he was monitoring wider than his brief, and because he had spent 2 months studying that species' diplomatic register before the summit. He sent the correction through 3 back channels, framing it as a technical note from a monitoring system rather than a human observation. A correction attributed to support staff from a probationary species would be reviewed more slowly than a correction attributed to a technical system. This was a fact he had learned through experience and had adapted to. The way you adapted to all the small structural absurdities of working in an environment designed around different assumptions than the ones you operated from. The translation was corrected. The proposal's standing was restored accurately. The session continued. Later, Mira passed him a coffee substitute and a questioning look. You have been sending more back-channel alerts than the entire human diplomatic team combined, she said quietly. I have a wider monitoring scope than most of the team, he said, which was accurate as far as it went. Wider than your designated brief allows. He said nothing. Mira looked at him for a moment, then at the session floor, then back at him. For what it is worth, she said. The last 3 sessions have gone more smoothly than any summit session I have attended. The flag rate in the official incident log is the lowest recorded in 12 years. She paused, just noting that. She moved off to her monitoring station. Daniel returned to his. Neither of them said anything more about it. This was the texture of his days at the summit. A constant, precise, invisible labor of prevention. The kind of work that succeeded by producing nothing, that measured its effectiveness in the absence of disasters. He had spent 6 years becoming very good at it. He had also spent 6 years watching it generate no record of his competence, no acknowledgement of his expertise, no mechanism through which the contribution could be built upon. The work happened. The incidents did not. The work did not exist in any official sense. He had told himself this was fine. He had believed it, mostly. The distinction between mostly believing something and fully believing, it was something he generally avoided examining too closely. The Valorian delegation arrived 90 minutes into the session. During a recess between agenda items, Daniel noticed them the way you noticed a change in air pressure. Not a single dramatic signal, but a collective shift in the room's attention that preceded any direct observation. Conversations throughout the hall were pausing, postures adjusting, attention reorienting toward a platform descending from the upper section with the particular precision that seemed intrinsic to Valorian movement. Controlled, deliberate, carrying the calm authority of people who had been practicing this for 10,000 years. Even from across the hall, the bioluminescent markings were extraordinary. Patterns of living light moved across their skin in gradations of blue and gold, constantly shifting. The Valorian Empire was one of the 5 oldest civilizations in the Concordance. When Valorian scholars spoke of their early period, they were referencing a time when humanity's ancestors were learning to control fire. The tall one, Mira said, appearing at his elbow with the careful reverence of someone who had done extensive personal research. Silver undertone in the markings. That is Princess Kalavi, heir to House Solarian. She has never attended a full summit before. Her faction wants merit-based evaluation of galactic standing instead of the current seniority hierarchy, which she is arguing for from a position of enormous inherited seniority. Daniel noted. The irony is not lost on anyone, but apparently she is sincere about it. Mira paused. Rumor is she came here specifically to do something dramatic. She has been watching the proceedings for 3 days without formally participating. That is unusual for someone of her rank. Daniel looked at the platform. The princess stood slightly apart from the rest of her delegation, not isolated, but apart in the way of someone who had chosen to observe the room rather than perform for it. Her gaze moved through the assembly with a methodical patience, his professional instincts registered as genuine attention. She was actually watching, not displaying the act of watching, but conducting it. He made a note, filed it, returned to his monitoring. 3 hours and 40 minutes into proceedings. Daniel caught the signal. The shift in standing posture on the Valorian platform was subtle enough that he almost attributed it to environmental adjustment, but the bioluminescent pattern change was unambiguous. His database flagged it within 2 seconds as formal announcement. Elevated urgency. A shift not of emotion but of preparation. The biological equivalent of drawing breath before something that needed to fill a room. He flagged it, checked the current agenda. 3rd-tier trade regulation. Nothing involving the Valorian Empire. He sent the flag to Ambassador Chen's pad with a question mark. Then Princess Kalavi moved to the edge of her platform, and the hall began to go quiet in a wave. The ripple of attention spread outward from the Valorian section through the assembled thousands, each section quieting as they registered the anomaly of an imperial heir standing during routine proceedings. By the time the wave reached the human corner, the silence was almost total. Daniel set down his datapad. I invoke the right of recognition. Her voice moved through the hall's acoustic architecture with perfect distributed clarity, translated simultaneously into hundreds of linguistic frameworks. The harmonics of Valorian speech came through even in translation, layered and resonant, with frequencies beneath frequencies that human vocal anatomy could not reproduce. Under ancient concordance protocols, I claim the privilege of formal declaration. The murmur that followed was the murmur of thousands of beings simultaneously searching historical databases. Daniel was already reading The Right of Recognition, established in the pre-standardization period, before most current member species had joined the concordance, reserved for declarations of personal and political significance. The last confirmed invocation was dated 2 centuries prior. The Summit Arbiter, a crystalline entity of considerable dimensions who had been moderating concordance proceedings since before humanity had discovered the wheel, acknowledged the invocation with a sound the translation system rendered as, "The chair acknowledges invocation of ancient protocol, pending confirmation of standing and clarification of intent." Princess Kalavi's markings intensified. She turned to face the assembled hall. Her gaze swept the room with patient precision. She moved through the ancient civilization delegations, the established mid-tier powers, the consolidated states. All of it was steady, attentive calm. Her gaze reached the human section, stopped, locked with unmistakable specificity, directly on Daniel. His first cognitive response was to check whether someone was standing behind him. He turned his head. There was no one. There was Lena, 3 feet to his left, Mira, 2 feet beyond her. His second response was the brief, desperate hope that a translation system had malfunctioned in some way that was redirecting perceived gaze direction. His third response came in the visceral way the body understands certain things before the mind is prepared to receive them. This was actually happening. To him, specifically. The blood left his face. She raised her hand, slowly, deliberately, with the quality of a gesture that had been planned in advance. She pointed at him, and she spoke, in every language simultaneously, to every species present. "That one belongs to me." The silence that followed was unlike anything Daniel had experienced in 6 years of diplomatic work. It was the silence of thousands of entities simultaneously removing everything else from their working attention and replacing it with a single shared question. He stood frozen. His data pad had lowered itself to his side through some automated muscular response. He was aware of Ambassador Chen turning around with an expression containing equal parts professional alarm and genuine shock. Of Lena taking a half step away from him, the way you stepped away from someone struck by lightning when you were not certain the charge had dissipated. Of every non-human eye within observable range now oriented toward him specifically. Princess Kalavi clarified, "For the record and for the Arbiter, I formally claim Daniel Reeves, cultural liaison of Earth's delegation. Under the right of recognition, he is under my protection, my acknowledgement, and my formal standing. Any challenge to this claim may be directed to me personally pursuant to concordance law." The silence broke. Thousands of beings from hundreds of species simultaneously consulted databases, conferred with advisors, and attempted to process information that fit no established category. The hall was suddenly, comprehensively awake in a way that 3 hours of trade regulation had not achieved. Daniel stood in the middle of it, his professional instincts, operating on their own authority in the absence of any conscious directive, noted that the Valorian delegation's advisors showed markings indicating significant concern. He noted that a ripple of complex political interest was moving through the mid-tier civilization sections, and then he noted something he had not anticipated. In the elevated platform reserved for the Tarquin Dominion, the eldest delegate, a woman his briefing documents identified as Ambassador Vorith, had stopped consulting with her advisors and was staring at him with an expression sharper than mere surprise. Vorith rose. Her voice, when it came, carried the particular weight of someone who had been speaking in rooms like this for longer than most species present had been members of the concordance. "The chair will note," she said, in the careful formal register of procedural challenge, "that the right of recognition has not been invoked in 2 centuries. The chair will further note that its historical applications have concerned beings of confirmed galactic significance or confirmed threat. This delegation respectfully requests clarification on which condition applies to a cultural liaison assistant of probationary species status." She did not say, "This is a fraud." She did not need to. The question contained the accusation precisely, with the deniability that centuries of diplomatic practice produced. The murmur of the hall shifted register, from confusion to something more pointed. Ambassador Chen's hand closed around Daniel's arm. "Control room," she said quietly, "now." As they moved through the side corridor, Daniel turned once and looked back toward the Valorian platform. Princess Kalavi was watching him leave. Her markings had settled into something calm and deliberate. the expression of someone observing the first movement of a process they had designed carefully and expected to unfold in a particular way. But she was also looking, briefly, at Vorith. And there was something in that look that told Daniel this had not been unexpected. The door of the control room sealed behind him. His life as invisible support staff had just ended, very publicly, and he had absolutely no framework for what came next. Before the formal meeting with Princess Kalavi was arranged, Sereth found him. This was not an accident. Sereth, the senior Valorian advisor, had navigated diplomatic circles long enough to understand that the most consequential conversations happened in corridors rather than suites. He appeared at the door of the secondary communications room where Daniel had been waiting during the delegation's internal discussion, alone, without the formal posturing of an official visit. "A moment," Sereth said. Daniel looked at him. The Valorian's markings were subdued to the formal neutral they used for external diplomatic contexts. But underneath the neutral, there were colors cycling slowly that his database identified as something in the territory of principled discomfort. "I want to speak plainly," Sereth said, "without the political framing that will surround the formal meeting." "All right," Daniel said. Princess Kalavi made this declaration with genuine conviction. "I do not question her intentions." Pause. "I question the method and its consequences. Ambassador Vorith's challenge was immediate. It will not be the last. There are civilizations in that hall who will interpret this claim as evidence that your species is engaged in some form of political manipulation. That you or your delegation cultivated a relationship with Valorian royalty, specifically to gain standing you have not earned." He held Daniel's gaze steadily. "The damage to Earth's diplomatic reputation from that interpretation may outlast any benefit the protection provides." Daniel considered this. "You are telling me to refuse," he said. "I am telling you what the refusal would prevent," Sereth said. "The formal meeting allows you that option, declining the claim on personal grounds, citing concern about the political implications, would read as a demonstration of integrity rather than cowardice. It would preserve your species' standing, and it would resolve this without the prolonged scrutiny that the coming week will otherwise produce." Daniel sat with this for a moment. He thought about what Sereth was describing. He thought about it honestly, as a risk assessment. Because that was what it was. And dismissing it without consideration would be exactly the kind of intellectual dishonesty he tried not to engage in. Then he thought about the Krelnak recess, the Tharsis posture adjustment, the Talarian attaché in the corridor at 700, the dozen other small actions that had kept this summit running smoothly and had never entered any record anywhere. He thought about 6 years of that work, and about the specific moment this morning when he had caught the signal on the Valorian platform, and his first instinct had been professional rather than personal. Had been. "Something significant is about to happen. Flag it. I appreciate that you came to tell me this directly," Daniel said. "I understand the risk you are describing." "But," Sereth said, "but the claim is accurate," Daniel said. "The work is real. The invisibility is structural and not accidental. If I refuse because the political scrutiny is uncomfortable, I am confirming the argument that beings like me should remain invisible when visibility becomes inconvenient." He met Sereth's gaze. "That is not a precedent I want to set, and I do not think it is one you actually want set either. Or you would have sent someone with less seniority to have this conversation." Sereth was quiet for a moment. His markings cycled through something complex. "You are more difficult to move than I expected," he said finally. "I have been doing this work in rooms where no one was designed to listen to me," Daniel said. "That requires a certain degree of being difficult to move." A pause. Then Sereth said something that surprised him. "The documentation that Princess Kailavi plans to submit in support of the claim. The monitoring records. You should review them before the formal meeting and confirm their accuracy yourself. Not because they are inaccurate, because when Vorith challenges them, and she will, the most credible confirmation will be yours." He left without further elaboration. Daniel sat alone in the communications room for 90 seconds, processing what had just happened. Then he requested the documentation files from Princess Kalavi's team, pulled up the monitoring records on his datapad, and began reading. Everything in them was accurate. He confirmed this methodically, entry by entry, timestamp by timestamp. And as he read his own actions documented in someone else's careful record, he felt something shift in his understanding. He had known, abstractly, that the work was real, reading it listed in precise factual sequence. Confirmed by station monitoring he had not known was watching, made real mean something more specific than abstract. He closed the pad, went to join Ambassador Chen. The diplomatic suite was neutral in every deliberate way. Warm amber light with no single source. Seating that configured to each occupant. Air that was a studied compromise. Princess Kalavi rose as they entered. Daniel had noted this in his mental briefing. Valorian royalty did not rise for support staff from probationary species. Not under any protocol he had encountered. She rose anyway, and she let the deliberateness of it be visible. Up close, she was more specific than the distance of the hall had allowed. The bioluminescent markings resolved at close range into structured language rather than simple biological display. Gradations of silver threading through gold in patterns that shifted with each movement. She stood a full head taller than Ambassador Chen. Sereth and two other advisors ranged behind her with markings subdued to diplomatic neutral. Daniel Reeves, she said. Thank you for accepting this meeting. I recognize that my declaration created disruption you did not ask for. You deserve an explanation before you are asked to process its implications. That is a considered way to describe causing a galactic incident, Ambassador Chen said, settling into her configured chair. The disruption was intentional, Princess Kalavi replied, without apology. The explanation I am offering is equally genuine. Both things are true simultaneously. She turned to Daniel. Please, sit. He sat. The chair reshaped itself under him. I will tell you exactly what I observed, she began, and then what I decided, and why. And then I would like to hear whether my reasoning makes sense, or whether I have made a significant error in judgment that I need to correct. That last sentence surprised him. He had constructed several versions of this meeting during the past hour, and none of them had contained the possibility that she might be wrong and wanted to know. I have been at this summit in an observational capacity for 3 days, she continued. My formal participation was scheduled for the second week, but I have been watching the proceedings carefully. Not the official record, but the actual mechanics. What I observed was interesting in ways the proceedings document will not capture. What did you observe? Daniel asked. Among other things, she said, you. She laid it out with the specificity of someone who had not merely noticed, but recorded. The Krelnak recess, the Tellurian corridor interception at 700, the Tharsis acknowledgement relay, 2 other instances he recognized, and 2 that surprised him, meaning she had caught things he had handled, so automatically he had barely registered doing them. She named them all, in sequence, with precision. None of those actions appear in the summit's official proceedings, she said. All of them contributed materially to the smooth operation of sessions the record will attribute to the presiding chair and the senior delegates. You prevented incidents. You facilitated understanding across species barriers that senior diplomatic staff were not monitoring. You performed work that by any reasonable standard constitutes essential diplomatic function. Her markings deepened, and it does not exist in any record that matters. Because you perform it as support staff from a species the Concordance has not yet decided to take seriously. Those are just my job, Daniel said. The monitoring, the flagging, the corrections. That is what a cultural liaison does. Yes, she said. That is exactly the point I am making. Sereth cleared his throat. Your Highness, with respect. Ambassador Vorith's public challenge reframes the situation significantly. What began as a political declaration about merit recognition has become a procedural question about the legitimacy of the claim itself. Conservative factions will argue that the documentation is insufficient without independent verification. That process could take months, well past the summit's close. I am aware of what Vorith is doing, she said. Her voice remained pleasant. It was still a complete stop to the argument. She wants the narrative established before the evidence can establish otherwise, which means the evidence must enter the record before the narrative hardens. She looked across the table. The monitoring documentation I have prepared is accurate. It is time-stamped. It shows contributions with no official credit attached. If Vorith wants to argue this claim is based on nothing, I will give the Concordance something to read. She looked at Daniel then. But first I want to ask you something I did not ask before I made the declaration. Something I should have. A pause. I made an assumption about what you would want. The assumption was that someone who did what you do, with the care and genuine investment you bring to it, would want the contribution to be seen, would want the invisible work to matter in ways the record reflects. Her markings shifted to something more open, less certain. I may have assumed incorrectly. If I did, I need to know. Because proceeding on a wrong assumption about someone's consent would undermine the very argument I am making. The room waited. Daniel looked at the hierarchy display at the table's edge. Earth near the bottom. Unencored. He thought about the Krelnak recess, the Tharsis adjustment, the Talarian attaché. He thought about 6 years of work that existed in no official form. He thought about the conversation with Sarath in the corridor, and about the specific quality of Sarath's argument, which had been compelling and which he had chosen not to accept anyway. He thought about why he had chosen not to accept it. But, first, there was something he needed to ask. Why me specifically? He said. You have described a political strategy requiring a concrete case. There are dozens of diplomatic support staff across this summit performing exactly the same kind of invisible essential work. Mid-tier species staff who have been doing it for decades, with more formal standing, more years of service, more complex contributions. Why not one of them? She was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of formulating a diplomatic answer, but of deciding how honest to be. Several reasons, she said. Some of them political, which I will be transparent about. Some of them specific to you. I appreciate the transparency. The political reason is that a human supports staff member from a 30-year probationary civilization is the most structurally extreme example of the problem I am describing. A mid-tier species staff member with decades of service has accrued informal recognition, social capital, some degree of acknowledgement even if it is not formalized. The gap between their contribution and their formal standing is real but navigable. The gap between your contribution and your formal standing is categorical. She gestured toward the hierarchy display. Using the most extreme case makes the argument most clearly. It makes it impossible for conservative factions to argue the case is marginal. So I am the clearest example because I have the least standing. Yes, which is one reason I needed to tell you this directly and ask rather than simply proceeding. Using someone's disadvantage as political evidence without their knowledge or consent is its own kind of disregard. She held his gaze. The specific reasons are different. I watched 3 days of beings performing competence for audiences. Most of what happens at a summit is performance. Contribution is calculated in terms of what it will be seen to produce. Who will acknowledge it? How it advances individual or factional standing, even the genuinely skilled beings. And there are many here. Shape their skill around its visibility. She paused. You do not do that. Every action I cataloged in that documentation was performed without any apparent calculation of its visibility or its benefit to you. You prevented the Krelnak incident through a channel that did not credit you. You redirected the Talarian attaché in a corridor at 7 in the morning when no one was watching. You sent the Tharsis correction through a technical system, rather than your own name, specifically, so it would be processed faster, at the cost of any attribution. Every action was shaped around the outcome rather than around who would see you achieve it. Daniel said nothing for a moment. That is just doing the job correctly, he said. Yes, she said. That is exactly what I mean. In these rooms, doing the job correctly for its own sake rather than for what it produces is unusual enough to be remarkable. He sat with that. Then he looked at Sarath directly, then at Princess Kalavi. You were not wrong, he said. He said it carefully, but completely. I want the work to be seen. I want contributions that actually change outcomes to exist in records that shape future decisions. I have told myself for 6 years that it does not matter whether they do, that the outcome is what matters. I have been half right. The incidents get prevented either way, but invisible competence cannot grow. Expertise that exists in no official record cannot be built upon or trusted at the level where actual decisions are made. He paused. Then he looked at Sarath directly. I was asked, before this meeting, to consider declining. The argument was that the political scrutiny would cause more damage than the protection would provide. That argument is not without merit. He looked back at Princess Kalavi. I am not accepting this because it is convenient. I am accepting it because the argument is correct. The work is real, the invisibility is structural. And if making it visible requires being a political symbol for a week and dealing with Vorith's challenge on the record, that is a reasonable cost for something that actually matters. Sarath's markings held very still. Then they shifted into something his database had no clean entry for. Something in the territory between reassessment and reluctant respect. Then we should move quickly, Sarath said, before the narrative hardens. It was the first time he had said anything that was not an objection. Princess Kalavi's markings shifted to something warm and certain. Yes, she said. We should. The next 2 hours were operational rather than philosophical. Princess Kalavi's team and Earth's diplomatic team reviewed the monitoring documentation together, entry by entry. Chen confirmed the accuracy of each annotation with the careful attention of someone who had been quietly aware that her cultural liaison assistant was working above his brief, and was now processing what that awareness had cost her. Vasquez handled the formal submission channels. The junior aides prepared secondary documentation packages for distribution to relevant parties. Daniel confirmed each entry in the monitoring record personally, in writing, with his name and designation attached. It was the most formal thing he had done in 6 years of diplomatic service. It was also the most direct. Not a flag sent through a back channel, in the hope that someone with authority might act on it, but a statement made under his own name in a record that would not be invisible. I noticed the results, Chen told him. In the brief moment they had alone while the teams worked around them. Sessions that went more smoothly than they should have. Problems that resolved before becoming incidents. I did not look closely enough at the mechanism. The system did not give you a structure for it, Daniel said. That is her point. It is also mine, Chen said quietly. Both things can be true simultaneously. The documentation went to the arbiter's office that afternoon. That evening, Daniel attended the diplomatic reception for the first time. His invitation specified full diplomatic access. He stared at it for a moment before accepting. The reception moved around him with a complex choreography of powerful beings performing casualness for strategic purposes. He moved through it with the particular doubled consciousness of someone who had spent years monitoring this kind of event from outside, and was now inside it for the first time. The difference was vertiginous. From outside, the patterns were visible but abstract. From inside, they pressed against you constantly. The weight of calculation in every exchange. Princess Kalavi found him in the 3rd hour. You handled the meeting well, she said. I said what was true, he said. That tends to be easier than the alternatives. Most beings in these rooms have forgotten that, she said, or decided it is a luxury they cannot afford. She stood beside him for a moment, both of them watching the room in its complex motion. Sarath spoke to you before the formal meeting. It was not a question. He made a reasonable argument, Daniel said. I did not agree with its conclusion. He came to tell me afterward, she said. He said you were more difficult to move than expected. I have been doing this work in rooms where no one was designed to listen to me, Daniel said. It requires a certain stubbornness. It requires a certain clarity, she corrected, about what matters and what does not. Pause. He has revised his position. Incidentally, not fully, partially. I noticed the marking shift in the meeting, Daniel said. She looked at him sideways. You are going to be very difficult to mislead. That was the idea, he said. She made a sound that was the Valorian equivalent of a laugh, layered in harmonics that the ambient noise of the reception room absorbed. Thank you, she said then, more quietly, for accepting. For not accepting because it was convenient, but because the argument is correct. That distinction matters. It mattered to me that you asked, he said. You did not have to. I did have to, she said, for the argument to be worth making. They stood in the reception together for a while longer, watching a galaxy go about its complicated business. Daniel thought about the day, about Sarath in the corridor and the formal meeting and the documentation he had confirmed with his own name attached, and the invitation that had arrived at his interface for a room he had never been invited into before. He thought about the difference between those things and the Krelnak recess, the Tharsis adjustment, all the other small precise actions that had never entered any record. The difference was not in the work itself. The work had been the same quality either way. The difference was in what the work could reach from here. Thank you, he said, for looking at something that was not designed to be seen, for deciding it was worth seeing anyway. Her marking settled into gold and silver. Thank you, she said, for being worth finding. The galaxy had opinions about Daniel Reeves. This was new. He discovered the full scope of the change in layers. The way you discovered the depth of a body of water, not by being told its measurements, but by wading in. The first layer was attention. Beings who had never registered the human section now registered it. He felt it before he identified it. A quality of the room's orientation that had shifted. Something in how crowds adjusted their positioning as he moved through corridors. How conversations did not exactly stop but recalibrated when he entered spaces they occupied. The second layer was access. Invitations that arrived at his interface for events his designation had never previously qualified for. Senior diplomatic briefings where his expertise was requested by name rather than by role. The Corrali delegation's primary cultural attaché reaching out through formal channels, which had never happened to anyone in the human section below senior rank. He accepted the consultation. It lasted 2 hours and produced a formal notation in the Corrales diplomatic record that translated roughly as, "Useful contact, recommend continued exchange." He had never had a formal notation in anyone's diplomatic record before. He read it 3 times. The third layer was the debates. And the third layer was the most complicated. The summit's 5th day opened with formal proposals for structural reform to the Concordance's recognition and evaluation systems. 3 proposals, introduced by Princess Kalavi's faction, with the careful precision of people who had been drafting them for years and waiting for exactly this kind of opening. The first proposed a merit recognition system for diplomatic support staff, a formal record of contributions currently classified as invisible, with standardized criteria for what constituted a contribution significant enough to enter the official proceedings transcript. The second proposed revised criteria for evaluating probationary species, creating pathways for advancement based on demonstrated capability, rather than purely on temporal thresholds, 30 years. The proposal, noted, was an arbitrary number reflecting historical convention rather than any principled assessment of what evaluation actually required. The third proposed that any contribution demonstrably affecting summit outcomes be credited in official records regardless of the formal status of the individual who made it. Daniel sat in the human section and listened to arguments about him, not always about him specifically. The debates frequently moved to principle, to historical precedent, to philosophical questions about how ancient institutional structures should balance stability against revision. But the concrete case was always present, always referenced. He was the specific instance through which the general question was being examined. And there was something deeply strange about monitoring a conversation that was simultaneously about galactic governance and about whether the work he had done in a corridor at 704 days ago belonged in the official record. He kept monitoring. He kept sending alerts. He kept doing the work. Because the work needed doing, regardless of what was being said about it. Ambassador Vorith made the conservative case with the patient authority of someone who had outlasted many previous reform movements and expected to outlast this one. Galactic stability, she argued, was not bureaucratic convenience but genuine achievement, built over millennia through carefully calibrated processes. The seniority-based hierarchy reflected accumulated wisdom. Probationary periods reflected genuine caution. The concordance did not keep newer species subordinate out of malice, but out of hard-won understanding that influence accorded prematurely produced consequences that took generations to untangle. She was not wrong. That was what made listening to her difficult. She was not wrong about stability, or about the complexity of what she was protecting. She was wrong about something else, about whether the thing she was protecting was what she thought it was. But the argument for stability was a real argument made in real good faith. And then, on the second day of formal debate, Vorith did something that was not in good faith. She rose during the documentation review session, the formal examination of the monitoring records Princess Kalavi had submitted, and introduced a procedural motion. The motion requested that the documentation be assessed by an independent verification committee before it could be entered as evidentiary material. An independent committee would take months to convene, months to review. The summit would end long before the documentation entered the record. And without the documentation, the concrete case for the reform proposals was significantly weaker. The hall murmured in the way it murmured when everyone understood what a motion was actually doing and was deciding how to respond. Daniel made his decision in the space of 4 seconds. He rose. Support staff did not rise during formal proceedings. Support staff did not address the assembly. Support staff sent alerts through back channels and hoped someone with authority acted on them in time. Daniel stood up. Point of personal information, he said. In the formal register that the concordance recognized as a right of any claimed individual during proceedings that concerned them directly. The arbiter, after a pause that contained something Daniel could only describe as institutional surprise, acknowledged him. The monitoring records in question document actions I personally performed, Daniel said, and his voice came out steadier than he had any right to expect. Steadied by 6 years of professional practice and the specific kind of calm that came from knowing exactly what you were saying was true. I can confirm their accuracy directly, without committee review. I do not require an independent body to verify what I did with my own hands at specific timestamps I can independently confirm. If Ambassador Vorith has specific concerns about specific entries, I am prepared to address them now, on the record, in front of this assembly. Silence. The particular weighted silence of a hall recalibrating. Vorith looked at him across the vast space of the Grand Convergence Hall. He could not read her bioluminescent expression from this distance, but he could read her posture, and her posture said, "I did not expect that." Across the hall, Princess Kalavi's markings had shifted to something bright and precise. The Arbiter rendered its decision within a minute. Point of personal information from a directly involved party was sufficient to admit the documentation without independent committee review. Pursuant to established concordance law, the documentation entered the record immediately. Vorith did not withdraw, but she did not escalate either. She returned to her seat with the measured grace of someone absorbing new information and recalculating. The hall, for its part, did not return immediately to the business of the session. A ripple moved through the assembled thousands. Not the shocked ripple of the original declaration, but something more considered, more deliberate. Species who had been attending the concordance for centuries had just watched a human support staff member exercise a legal right most of them had never seen used. They were processing what that meant. The Tarquin Dominion's secondary representative, a younger being whose markings carried the specific configuration of someone navigating disagreement with their own delegation's position, sent a communication through official channels to Daniel's interface. He read it during the recess. It said only, "The right of personal information is rarely exercised because most beings who have standing to exercise it also have standing to avoid the situation that requires it. The fact that you did not avoid it is noted." He saved the communication. Then he sent an alert about a developing acoustic issue in the Vethiri section that he had flagged 12 minutes earlier, and which was now approaching the threshold where it would become visible without intervention. The alert was acted on in 60 seconds. Daniel sat down. His hands were shaking slightly under the data pad. He set the pad on the surface, took one precise breath, and returned to monitoring. Around him, beings who had never acknowledged the human section were looking at him with expressions he was only beginning to have the language to read. He sent 4 more alerts that afternoon. All 4 were acted on within 60 seconds, not 3 minutes. 60 seconds. Each time, with acknowledgement addressed to him by name. Small things. He still knew their weight. During the recess after the documentation decision, a Vernathi diplomat approached the edge of the human section for the first time since the summit had begun. 800 years of concordance membership, firmly mid-tier in standing. "Your monitoring work during the Karali Krelnak session," the diplomat said, in careful common language. "The translation calibration suggestion. We adopted it for our own team." "Thank you for letting me know," Daniel said. The framing was precise. A pause, carrying something his database identified as deliberate peer-level acknowledgement. "We will be watching your work at future summits." The diplomat returned to their section without further elaboration. Daniel made a note. The small things still mattered. They mattered more now, not less. On the 6th day, the Vernathi introduced an amendment to the second proposal. Rather than replacing the temporal threshold entirely, the amendment created a parallel pathway. Species could advance through the standard seniority route, or through a demonstrated merit evaluation conducted by a mixed committee. Both pathways would produce equivalent standing. It was the kind of compromise that worked in the concordance, giving conservative factions the preservation of existing mechanisms while creating alternatives that did not require those mechanisms to be used. Princess Kalavi's faction supported it. Vorith's faction, after 2 hours of consultation, did not oppose it. The Arbiter moved the amendment to formal consideration. Daniel watched this happen and felt, alongside the surreal awareness of being the context in which it was happening, something quieter and more specific. This was how change moved in ancient institutions, not through declarations alone. Declarations forced conversations. Conversations shifted positions. Shifted positions enabled compromises. Compromises became structures. Structures became the new baseline. It was slow, genuinely slow. He was also, for the first time in his professional life, inside the conversation, not monitoring it from outside, present in it. Part of the evidentiary record that was shaping what it produced. That mattered. He was being honest with himself about the fact that it mattered. On the summit's final day, the Arbiter announced results. The first proposal passed with a qualified majority, a 2-year implementation timeline, standardized criteria to be developed by working committee, a pilot program at the next 2 summits before full integration. Not immediate, but real, with formal deadlines and accountability structures attached. The second proposal passed with the Vernathi Amendment incorporated. Vorith's bloc abstained rather than opposing. Abstention from the Tarquin bloc was, by historical standards, nearly equivalent to tacit approval, and everyone present understood this. The third proposal was referred to a specialized committee, with instructions to report back within 18 months. Not yet, not never. The distinction mattered. It was not revolution, but it was genuine movement. The machinery had shifted. Conversations conducted informally for decades had been formalized. Species that had never taken official positions on these questions had now taken them. The record contained arguments and evidence and compromise positions that would shape the next debate, and the one after that. The galaxy was vast and ancient and moved with geological slowness, but it moved. The closing ceremonies concluded in the early evening. Station time. The final formal session wound down through acknowledgments and procedural notes and the particular diplomatic warmth that summits generated in their last hours. Princess Kalavi found him in one of the secondary corridors, away from the main hall's density. "You survived," she said. The amusement in her markings was warm and genuine. First experience as political symbol. 7 days. Still functional. Minor existential recalibration, he said. Nothing structural. I am counting it successful. As am I. She fell into step beside him. The documentation decision was unexpected. I noticed Varith's motion would delay the record by months, he said. The only person in the hall who could address the content of that documentation directly was me, so I addressed it. You rose during formal proceedings as support staff. The concordance has a provision for it. Point of personal information. I checked the provision before I stood. Her markings moved through something warm and precise. You checked the legal provision first. I check things first, he said. That is more or less the entire basis of my professional competence. She made the sound that was the Valorian equivalent of a laugh. I think Vorith did not expect you to speak. I think she expected the human support staff member to remain seated and hope someone else intervened. That would have been the safer option. Daniel agreed. But the documentation was accurate. The most efficient answer to a question about accuracy is the person who can directly confirm it. He paused. Also, sitting quietly and hoping seemed wrong for reasons that were harder to articulate. I know what those reasons are, she said. I saw them before I ever spoke to you. They walked for a moment in quiet. Outside the corridor's viewports, the stars were visible, a particular dense field that surrounded Celestia Station's orbital position. Ancient light from distances that resisted comprehension. What comes next? She asked. Not formally. I know the formal structure. Earth will promote you. Give you responsibilities appropriate to your new standing. I am asking what you want to do with it. He had been thinking about this in the quiet moments of the past week. I want to keep doing what I do, he said. The cultural facilitation, the mediation, the work of helping species understand each other well enough that they do not accidentally make things worse. I think I am genuinely good at it, and I think it genuinely matters. He paused. But I want to do it at levels where my judgment is incorporated rather than forwarded and hoped for, where I can be in rooms where decisions are actually made. That is what the new access provides, she said. I know, I am not taking it for granted. He met her gaze. I will also make mistakes. I have been trained for support work. High-level facilitation has significant overlaps and significant gaps. I am going to walk into rooms I have not been trained for and get things wrong. What will you do when that happens? Fix it, he said. Learn from it. Not let it become a reason to stop. Her markings settled into the deep, warm configuration he had learned to read as genuine approval. That is the correct answer, she said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said something in a different register, quieter and more direct than anything said in a formal diplomatic context. I want to say something that is not political and not strategic. What I told you in the suite was true. You were selected partly because you represent the argument most clearly, and partly because I had watched you work and respected what I saw. A pause. But there is a third thing I did not say in that meeting, because it was not the right place for it. Watching someone work with that quality of integrity, with genuine care for the thing itself rather than for what it produces, is rare. I have been in these spaces for a long time. I do not encounter it frequently. Her markings held steady. I am glad I noticed. Whatever the concordance does with the conversations we forced this week, and however long it takes for those conversations to produce what they should, that gladness is mine and is not contingent on the outcome. Daniel stood with that for a moment. Let it settle. Thank you, he said, simply. It was the most accurate thing he could offer, and he meant it without remainder. She extended her hand, a gesture combining Valorian formal acknowledgement and human greeting, a hybrid she had clearly constructed deliberately. He understood this, because he was a cultural liaison who had spent 6 years cataloging exactly these kinds of gestures, and understanding it made taking her hand feel like more than protocol. It felt like two people choosing a new language for something that did not have an existing one yet. Safe travels. Daniel Reeves, she said. I suspect we will interact again. Diplomatic circles are surprisingly small, given how large the galaxy is, with frequent confusion and occasional panic, he said. But I think eventually successfully. Her markings settled into gold and silver, warm and certain. Eventually is enough, she said. It usually is. He returned to Earth, with a different life than he had left with. The change was not visible from the outside, not immediately. He went home to the same apartment, the same quiet routines, the same professional discipline he had been building for 6 years. His sister, when he told her over a long-delayed communication, said, "So you got promoted." And he spent 20 minutes explaining what had actually occurred. After which she said, "So they finally noticed you are good at your job," and he said more or less, yes, and realized that was, in fact, what it came down to. The Concordance had been forced to notice. That was the whole mechanism. Stripped to its simplest form. Forced notice. Through an ancient protocol invoked in front of 11,000 witnesses. By someone with the standing to make the noticing consequential. And then sustained through documentation. Through confirmation on the record. Through a moment when the noticed person had stood up and said, "I was there, I did this, I can confirm it." Earth's diplomatic corps promoted him with the careful consideration of an institution updating its frameworks to accommodate a circumstance it had not predicted. His new title reflected responsibilities rather than organizational position. He was assigned to negotiations that had previously been above his access level. He sat at tables where his cultural expertise shaped discussions rather than supported them from a distance. He caused 3 incidents through inexperience, as he had predicted. The first was a sequencing error in a 3-species mediation that produced 20 minutes of confusion before he identified the problem and corrected it. He documented exactly what had gone wrong and why. And the documentation became part of a briefing he wrote for Earth's core about how to avoid the same error. 2 other diplomatic teams cited it within 6 months. The second was a cultural assumption that turned out to be outdated by 40 years. Because species cultures changed and databases did not always keep pace. He identified it before it became irretrievable, made the necessary corrections, and submitted a revised protocol as a formal recommendation to the Concordance's Cultural Database Working Group. The recommendation was accepted in modified form. His name was attached to it in the working group's formal record. He read the record, set it down, went back to work. The third incident was the most interesting. He walked into a negotiation and correctly identified a dynamic that the senior diplomatic team had misread. Said so clearly in a session where his standing was now sufficient to be heard, turned out to be right, and in the process contradicted a senior diplomat with 20 years of service. This produced friction that was less about cultural misunderstanding than about the difficulty of someone new having institutional authority. He and the senior diplomat had a direct conversation afterward. It was uncomfortable. Produced. At its conclusion, a working relationship that both of them found genuinely useful. He learned from all 3, in the specific way you learned from mistakes you were allowed to make and acknowledge and analyze, rather than mistakes you had to conceal, because the cost of acknowledging them exceeded the cost of hiding them. A communication from Princess Kalavi arrived 8 months after the summit, formal in structure and warm in register, informing him that the merit recognition protocol had survived committee deliberation, and that his summit contributions were officially entering the Concordance proceedings record. She also noted that the parallel evaluation pathway for probationary species had received its first applicants, that 2 civilizations besides Earth were actively pursuing advancement through the merit route, and that the mandatory acknowledgement proposal had emerged from its specialized committee, with a strong recommendation for adoption at the next summit. Change is slow, she wrote near the end, but it tends to compound. The first summit at which the new recognition system operates will be different from this one. The one after that will be different again. In 20 years, it will be difficult to remember that these records did not always exist, the way it is now difficult to remember many things that once seemed fixed. Continue the work. It is adding to something larger than either of us can currently see. He wrote back the same day. I will, he wrote, I noticed the compounding is already happening in small ways. I had a consultation last week with a delegation from a species that has been in the concordance for 300 years. They asked me, by name, for my analysis of a communication breakdown they were experiencing with a newer member. 3 months ago, that request would not have existed as a possibility. Now it is a Tuesday afternoon. I think that is what compounding looks like from the inside. Also, I caused 2 more incidents. Both were educational. I am keeping count. Her response arrived 11 days later, faster than standard interstellar communication suggested, which told him she had a priority flag on his address. Educational incidents are the correct kind. Keep me informed of the count. He saved the exchange in a folder he labeled, with a precision that would have been legible only to someone who understood exactly what it referred to. Small things. He reviewed the briefing for his next assignment, a facilitation between 3 species whose previous attempts at direct negotiation had produced results ranging from profound confusion to near incident, and whose communication systems were incompatible in ways that required exactly the kind of careful, patient, precise work he had spent 6 years perfecting, and was now finally permitted to perform at the level where it could make a real difference. He wrote the briefing in full, with his name attached to every section, knowing it would be read and incorporated and cited if it worked. And then he thought about Princess Kalavi's declaration, and about the 4 words that had shifted his existence, and about what it meant that someone had looked across a hall filled with thousands of beings from hundreds of species, and decided that one of them was worth seeing. He thought about this not with the shock of those first moments, and not with the complicated disorientation of the week that followed. He thought about it with the quieter understanding of someone who had had enough time to let it settle into meaning. He had been doing good work. The work had been real. The value of the work had not been contingent on the declaration. It had existed beforehand. In every prevented incident and facilitated understanding and corridor intervention that had never entered any record, what the declaration had done was create a path from that value to its consequences. He had not asked for any of it. But sitting at the beginning of a career the declaration had made possible, he decided that being seen, having the contribution acknowledged, having the invisible work enter the record where it could compound into something larger, was worth everything it had cost. The galaxy was vast. It was ancient. It moved with the patience of something that had been doing this for longer than his species had been upright. But it was also changing, in the specific, incremental, compounding way that ancient institutions changed when they were pushed in the right direction with enough sustained force. Through one dramatic declaration, through the documentation that confirmed it, through a moment when a support staff member had stood up in a room full of beings who had not expected him to speak and confirmed, on the record, in front of everyone who mattered. I was there. I did this. And it was real. Daniel Reeves reviewed the briefing one final time, made 2 small corrections, sent it, and got back to work.